Well, actually, Gay Asians Toronto was founded not just by me, but with also a couple of other people. There was myself and Gerald Chan, who is from Hong Kong, Nito Marquez, who is from the Philippines, and Tony Souza, who is from India. So there were actually four of us. For me, I had been to a conference in Washington, which was the first national march for lesbian and gay rights in Washington, D.C. in 1979, along with Tony Souza, who was a friend of mine. And there was the first time that I met other gay and lesbian Asians, people who identified as such at this conference. Some of them were Asian American, but many of them came from other places like Hong Kong or Malaysia, etc. And it was very exciting for me because I had not, in that period, Canada and Toronto was not as multicultural as it is today. So, in gay settings, you would hardly ever see other people who weren't white. And so it was very exciting to meet these other people. And many of us, after that conference in 1979, went back to different cities across North America and started different groups. So that was that was the impetus for me getting involved in trying to do something similar and have those kind of conversations here in Toronto. We did a couple of things. One is before we started, we wanted to make sure that we had all of the different kinds of people in place, which is right. This is partly because of where I come from. I am of Chinese descent, but I am fourth generation from the Caribbean. Yeah. So I grew up in a very multiracial society, and I had come to thinking about these kinds of politics through a lens of anti-racism. So we also tried to get in touch with Asian lesbians as well. But again, it was a very, very small community. So and in the end, we couldn't find women who were interested in starting the group. So the four of us started it. There was a gay magazine that was published out of Toronto. My partner was a member of the publishing collective. And I had volunteered there. And we took out an ad in that magazine asking for people who were gay and Asian. We also did flyers. And I still have them from 1980 or whatever, where we posted Chinatown, for example, advertising for people to come to our meetings. And I would say we had like 10, 15, and then the organization eventually grew to be quite large. I think people came to the group for a number of reasons. One of them is we did counseling. So for people who were having, it was peer counseling because we were all figuring these things out ourselves, but a way of thinking through questions of family, for example, questions of relationships. At that point, particularly a lot of, say, gay Asian men would have relationship issues with, say, for example, white partners, and a mix of, for example, the way that racism would appear within the intimate relationships. So there was a lot of either direct counseling or discussion groups around these questions. There was a founding of a group called the Gay Asian AIDS Project, where when AIDS came about, and that morphed and eventually became, joined other organizations and is now the Asian Community AIDS Services, ACAS. We also, as I mentioned, had these concerts and, as you mentioned, celebration, which also had a creative outlet for folks. It was held in Village by the Grange, which is a park very close to Chinatown. And so the parade went through Chinatown. And the person who actually was really involved in that is Dr. Alan Lee. He was a person who gave a speech, and then he and the group went through Chinatown, which I think was very momentous.
What's the reaction of the people in Chinatown back then?
I can't remember very well, but I think it was interest and perhaps a bit of consternation. You have to remember that in 1984, although there were limited, there was a limited decriminalization from 1969 in Canada for adults over 21 in private. If you were lesbian or gay, you could still be legally fired from your job or evicted from your house. There was no human rights protection. So it meant that to come out in public, people were taking risks. And so it was hard to convince people, to find people who were willing to come out for those reasons, as well as people who were willing to be public in relation to the possibility of their, if their families saw them on video. Some obvious ones, which is that, as I said, in 1984, there was no human rights protection, right? 32 years later, all of the demands that had been put forward as gay rights demands, such as human rights protection, and then all the way to same-sex marriage, had all been passed by then. So the legal context had changed quite a bit. Although within the Toronto context, for example, there was, since that, raids on arrests of men in parks, etc. But so that legal context had changed. The demographics of the city had completely changed within Canada. So now, Toronto is now one of the most multicultural cities in the world. That had changed. But what was striking to me is that the identities have changed. So that in 1984, the terms we were using were gay and lesbian. But now in the the teens of the millennium, I'm not sure how we refer to the era still, you have the real blossoming of transgender identities, as well as, things like non-binary, people who are not, who don't identify with one gender or another. So that the identities themselves has changed, and so the politics of sexuality and gender have changed. My story is very, very different because my father was born in China and left China in the 1920s to go to Trinidad. But my mother's grandparents left China in the 1860s to go to Trinidad as indentured workers. So my family is even my parents' family is very hybrid. By the time I came to Canada at the age of, I think I was 19 by the time I arrived in Canada, I had gone through all of these different societies and seen very, very different contexts. So when I came to Canada and met Chinese Canadians, for example, it was, I found that the Chinese Canadian story, the way the Chinese Canadians narrated themselves, did not sync up with my own experience of being Chinese Trinidadian or being Chinese in Ireland. So this circulation of being what it means to be Chinese, what it means to be Asian, what it means to be a human being was very complicated by the time I arrived in Canada. Yeah, I mean, there was an eventual acceptance with my mom. It was kind of interesting, as I've often told this story as well, that when I came out to my mom, it was a very Chinese kind of reaction. So she said two things. Who's going to take care of you when you get old? You won't have children, who's going to take care of you? And the other thing was, so you might be gay, so what prevents you from getting married? And having children and a family, which from my having counseled many, I think it's less so now, but in the 70s and 80s, a lot of people, I think, unfortunately for the women in those families, the wives, a lot of gay men married and had children and maybe were gay on the side within Chinese families. That was not uncommon. I think both here and more so in Asia. I feel like I'm very lucky because I'm very much integrated with my family and with my cousins, etc. But I know that a lot of people have fear of coming out. A lot of people experience discrimination within their family. A lot of people feel like they have to live in the closet, etc. I had to push back. It was tough. There was a point at which when my parents were on their own, and my cousins would like call me up and say, you really should move in with your family and, take care of your parents, etc. And I, was very involved in caretaking my parents, but I insisted on living with my partner. And that really is kind of going against the tradition, because as a single child, even though I wasn't really single, as a single child, that should have been my duty to move in. So there was a way in which I really had to kind of stand up and hold my ground. Yeah, I think that different families have different dynamics, because I think even younger people I meet now can have those kind of pressures. Mm-hmm. Whereas people, my age, often my generation of folks, whether lesbian or gay, or often have negotiated relationships with their family. Many of the men and the women in reorientations are now out and have very comfortable relationships with their very quote-unquote traditional families. Whereas I do know that there are people who come from modern families that are not religious, that are not, really have any excuse, but they still have these kind of reluctance to come out, or the parents still react badly. And I have to say, it's also not it's not about education, it's not about class. It really is very much about particular family dynamics, I would say now.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was very enjoyable talking with you.